Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Healy, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Civics Now Coalition, which is a project of iCivics. And I'm honored to be the moderator for today's program. This Commonwealth Club program is part of the club's Creating Citizens initiative. Other programs in this series can be found on the club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Before introducing today's panelists, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the current state of civic education in the United States. On the heels of the anniversary of January 6, 2021, and amidst ongoing toxic political polarization and institutional dysfunction, it's clear that our constitutional democracy is in peril. Civic knowledge is alarmingly low, with a bare majority of Americans able to identify the three branches of government, actually a historic high, and nearly 1 in 5, 20%, unable to identify any of the branches. Simultaneously, confidence in our democratic institutions has cratered. Confidence in the three branches ranges from 5% for Congress to 16% for the presidency. Civic ignorance and distrust fuel political polarization, registering at the highest levels in the modern era. An NBC News poll released yesterday reveals that 70% believe that the nation has become so polarized that it cannot resolve the major issues of the day. A stunning 76% across the political spectrum agree that democracy and majority rule are threatened. These deeply troubling trends correlate with the generational marginalization of civic education in K-12 schools. According to the Council of Chief State School Officers, 44% of school districts have reduced time spent on social studies in the past 2 decades. The sidelining of social studies coincides with stagnant student proficiency across multiple iterations of the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics, the nation's report card, a stunningly low range of achievement from 20 to 25% proficiency. This neglect of social studies and civics is directly linked to decades-long policies at the state and federal levels, mandating testing of basic literacy, English language arts, and math through funding incentives. Specifically, and as a direct consequence of education policy, civic education has been chronically underfunded both federally and locally. Currently, the federal government invests a mere 5 cents per K-12 students in civics, compared to $54 in STEM subject areas. This collective evidence makes clear that decades of decline in both the quality and quantity of civic education have contributed significantly to the discord, dysfunction, and widespread disengagement plaguing our nation today. Quite simply, civic education, understanding America's systems of government and its civic structures, behaviors, and expectations, has become a national security imperative in 2022. And that's what we're here to discuss today. I'm pleased to be joined by 2 people who know this issue as well as anyone. Dr. Mildred Millie Solomon, who's the president of the Hastings Institute. Dr. Solomon has an international reputation for her research on and advocacy for wiser healthcare and science policy. In addition to her leadership role at the Hastings Center, she's a professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School, where she directs the school's fellowship in bioethics. Suzanne Spalding is the senior advisor, Homeland Security, in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Suzanne served as Undersecretary for the Department of Homeland Security, where she led the National Protection and Programs Directorate, now called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, charged with strengthening cybersecurity and protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, including elections. I'm pleased to have both Suzanne and Millie here to discuss this pressing subject. And just one important housekeeping tip before we get started with our panelists. If you have a question you want me to ask Suzanne or Millie or both, please put it in the Zoom chat. Questions posted there will be forwarded to me throughout the program. So Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start with you and picking up on the work that you did at the Department of Homeland Security and the work that you're currently doing at CSIS. How did this work collectively lead to your assessment that reinvigorating civics is a national security imperative.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you to the California Commonwealth Club for having this important conversation today and for including me in it. It's been a real passion of mine for a number of years now, and I've been honored to work closely with Sean Healy and iCivics as we've tried to bring the national security imperative to this discussion about the urgent need for reinvigorating civics education. And it really, I will confess to having come to the battle to reinvigorate civics education relatively late compared to folks like Sean and Louise Dubé and so many others who've been working in the trenches for decades. I was in the national, in the national security world for most of my career. And most recently, as Sean said, at the Department of Homeland Security, working to help lead the men and women who were working so hard in 2016 to safeguard our elections. And when I got out in 2017, I did so with the full understanding that what we saw in 2016 in terms of information operations from one of our main adversaries, Russia, was really just part of a broader campaign, a long-term campaign by Putin and the Kremlin to undermine public trust and confidence in democracy and democratic institutions. And fully understood that they do so by taking advantage of weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our own making, right? And that other nations were taking a page from the Kremlin's playbook, and increasingly domestic voices. So when I got to CSIS, we really, did a focus initially on adversary attacks on democracy, and then a deep dive on our justice system, because I'm trained as a lawyer, and I thought to myself, if I wanted to undermine democracy, aside from elections, where would I go next? What other institution is so dependent on public trust and confidence in the legitimacy of the process to respect the legitimacy of the outcome? And I thought, of course, of our court system. So we started looking and unfortunately found lots of evidence of information operations coming out of the Kremlin, trying to get Americans to weaken their trust in our justice system and its independence and impartiality, again, picking up on legitimate grievances. And as we thought about what are the ways in which we can begin to counter this activity, we put out a report on May 1st called Beyond the Ballot. One of the most important things we realized we needed to do, in addition to working with the platforms and all of the other things that you hear about to go after disinformation, would be to build public resilience against the content of that disinformation, regardless of the source, right? And so that means understanding what is that messaging all about. It is about getting Americans to give up on the idea of democracy. And that is so much easier to do if Americans are ignorant about the foundations of our democracy. If the goal is to divide us, if we haven't had that civic literacy to remind us of our shared values, that goal for our adversaries and bad actors is so much easier. If their goal is to get us to conclude, as Putin's is, that democracy is irrevocably broken, then if we haven't been empowered to understand how to hold flawed institutions accountable and how to be effective agents of change, then we are more susceptible to a message that it is irrevocably broken, as opposed to flawed, and we must be the agents of moving toward a more perfect union. So that's how we came to this sense of civics was really vital to our national security.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I want to turn next to you, Dr. Stallman. And you're in a totally different field, bioethics, and there is a distinct relationship, we think, between the work that you're doing in civics, but we often think of civics as just kind of the purview of social studies teachers. I referenced that a lot in my opening remarks, but I'm really interested in what you see as the distinction or relationship between scientific literacy and civic literacy.
Thanks very much for having me, Sean. Yes, I think it might seem unusual for a leader in bioethics to be having a conversation about national security, but I think the connections are actually quite profound, and we're seeing the national security threats in the way in which we've been unable to use public health and traditional public health measures to manage something that science has given us the means to manage. but civics is or the erosion of civic learning is standing in the way. Your question was about the distinction between the two kinds of literacy. Well, a shorthand response I would give is that science strives to tell us how things work or what causes something. It's descriptive and focused on mechanisms of causality. Civics and bioethics actually are focused on how should we live together. They're should questions. What do we think are the best ways to show respect for one another? What values do we hold and which ones do we want to privilege? Why do we think one policy is more inclusive or fairer or more respectful of human dignity than another? So they're really very different literacies, and yet we need them. We need them both. And one of the reasons I was attracted to the field of bioethics is because it actually merges these two. In bioethics, we look at the ethical questions raised in the life sciences. Should we mandate vaccines? We've got them now. Science brought them to us. And obviously, it's tearing us apart as a society to figure out how we can take advantage of those breakthroughs in science. Well, should we mandate them is an ethics question, and it's a civics question also. And what unites them is that they engage with our sense of what are the rules by which we should live and what are the values that we should be upholding in the policy decisions that we make.
Thank you so much. Suzanne, turning back to you, you talked in your opening remarks how you came to this issue. You talked about how this, you've deemed it in this decline in civic literacy a potential national security threat. And I'm really interested in your specific expertise in mis and disinformation and managing risk around that. How is that similar to managing traditional cyber risks that you've done in your previous work?
Yeah, well, there's a direct relationship, I think, first of all, between civics and cybersecurity. And it really builds off of Dr. Solomon's really insightful remarks about civics, that fundamentally having this community aspect, right? How do we live in community? The sense of civic responsibility, I think, and that needs to be, taught. And the lack of that sense of civic responsibility, I think, has contributed to our public health crisis, but it also contributes to cyber insecurity. When I used to be the undersecretary and I would go around the country and I would talk to audiences about cybersecurity being a shared responsibility, right? That we all have to do our part. I would often get a lot of blank looks, people not really appreciating the importance of considering how their actions can weaken their family, their community, their nation. But traditionally, what I came to DHS to do traditional cybersecurity, not to do disinformation, but to do traditional risk management across cyber and physical. It's, there's a formula we use: threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. You assess your risk as a factor of all three of those. Then you look at how you can mitigate against each of those. And one of the ones that often gets neglected is consequences. How do we mitigate the consequences? And you have to understand, as you're going after trying to deal with cybersecurity, we're worried about Russia today, right? With its threat to invade Ukraine, and we know that will be cyber actions. What is your adversary's objective? Right? Don't just focus on what is the technique. Really important to think about what are they trying to achieve. Now, what are the consequences they are trying to achieve? And how do we prevent them or reduce the likelihood that they can achieve that consequence? And so that's the thinking that I brought to this information operation or disinformation. It's not just the techniques. It's not just what platforms are they using and what accounts are they setting up and what does that look like? It's also what are they trying to achieve? And as I said earlier, I think they're trying to weaken us by weakening our commitment to democracy, our trust in institutions, our ability to mobilize, to take the actions that we need to take to say a strong, robust nation. And that's important to understand. So how are we going to reduce their ability to do that?
And thank you, Suzanne. And just as a reminder, as you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the YouTube chat, and I will relay them. And I think you touched on this, and just as you were concluding those remarks, Suzanne. But what initiatives have you undertaken to help manage some of those risks? You talked about empowering citizens and their resiliency, but what initiatives specifically have you been taking at CSIS to address those and mitigate those concerns?
Yeah, well, we started after our deep dive on the justice system, realizing that we also need to strengthen our institutions, not just kind of try to talk to the American public about how great they are, but to get those institutions to live up to our aspirations, to understand why there is this mistrust in those institutions. But also to understand that there is disinformation out there that is specifically targeting public trust in those institutions. So we started out with training for federal judges and for state and local judges. And we worked with the Federal National Judicial Center and Administrative Office of the Courts and the National Center for State Courts. And we did a whole series of workshops, particularly for the state courts. We reached over 40 states, educating them about the nature of the threat and the things that they should be doing right now to be in a better position to counter false information when it comes out. This is not about you shouldn't criticize the courts, right? This is about when false information, when disinformation, and when coordinated campaigns to undermine public trust in the courts are taking place. So we've done that judicial training, and we continue to do that. We did a year-long program on civics as a national security imperative that was a series of virtual fireside chats, including with Justices Sotomayor and Neil Gorsuch, in which they beautifully modeled civil discourse between two people who disagree strongly about issues that they care deeply, right? And yet they manage to have civil discourse. And that's so important. And then they talked, of course, about the importance of the rule of law and other really important things. Our very first program was on systemic racism as a national security threat and how civics can help to address that. But a whole series, retired generals, we had Bob Gates, so that. And now our newest initiative is called Civics at Work, because while we think investment in K through 12 is vital, absolutely must happen, it's a long-term investment. National security imperative means there's an urgency to this. We have an adult population that has suffered from the decline in civic education in schools. We need to improve their civic literacy and sense of civic engagement and responsibility now. Employers are a good way to get at adults through their workforce. So we have a program where we want companies, leaders, CEOs, presidents of companies to sign up to support civics education at the federal, state, and local level, to conduct internal civic literacy activities with their workforce, and to conduct external activities in support of civics in their communities.
Wonderful. And I know as I was preparing for today's program, reviewed a number of the videos and materials that you put together, but on the CSIS website, you've archived these great interviews you've done and some of the journal articles and testimony to Congress that you prepared. It's all available there, correct?
Yep. And I should say, one of the things that I don't know we've posted yet, but one of the most recent examples of the national security community coming around to this perspective is the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It's set up by Congress. Its final white paper was on disinformation and has strong recommendations for reinvigorating civics education.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I'm going to have one more question for Millie and Dr. Solomon, and then I'm going to start posing some of the questions from the audience. And this is close to home for iCivics. We've been part of a group of over 300 scholars and organizations that put forth a new roadmap for educating for American democracy. And a central hallmark of that roadmap is the principle of inquiry as a way to teach civics, as a way to teach United States history. And Dr. Solomon, from where you sit, what's the most effective and helpful way for educators and schools to think about inquiry across science and civics? I know that's something that you've written about extensively.
Yes. Inquiry is a wonderful and powerful concept. It says that education is about guiding students to pursue questions that are important to them and important to our society. And so I think the primary message is that we should be organizing all of our educational activities around compelling questions. And goodness knows we have some very powerful, compelling questions, especially ones that can't just be answered by the individual. I can decide to have an operation or not, but I can't decide whether, certain kinds of operations should be made available to the American population. We have collective problems that have to do with decisions about our shared environment and inquiry learning that targets those. What are we going to do about climate change? It's not just an individual decision. The vaccine question I do think is a security threat because we've been undermined in our ability to make collective decisions about how to manage this disease. The vaccine question is an interesting one because people that are fighting the idea of taking the vaccine are coalescing around a civil liberties argument. I was going to say a specious civil liberties argument, but at least a questionable civil liberties argument, which I think we need to engage with, because the claim is made that I can't be told what to do with my body, or I don't. It's up to me. It's my choice. And a sound inquiry-oriented civics education would know some of the history of where we got our civil liberties. What did different political philosophers think about this? From the earliest writings on civil liberties, it was always understood that one's liberty ends when it harms another. But no one is talking about the harms to others. They're just talking about their own personal choices. And also the earliest people to write about rights always also wrote about obligations. Rights exist with obligations. So inquiry is saying education is about solving real world problems, especially now in our time, collective problems about our shared environment. And it should be driven first by questions. That can take many forms. I'll just say one more thing about that. Mira Levinson, who's a terrific researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Jacob Fay have written a wonderful book about ethical dilemmas in schools. And I had the pleasure of writing with Mira in a special report that the Hastings Center published. It's called Democracy in Crisis, and people can get it for free on the Hastings website. And Mira and I wrote about how to do this in schools. And we advocated three things: action civics, where you take a question, so it's inquiry, you take a question, the kids work in teams to research it, to identify all the different stances and perspectives on it, to come to their own conclusions, to give reasons for their conclusions, and then to take some kind of action step to advance their conclusion. So action civics, really creative ways to engage kids on school boards, even have youth representatives on school boards, commissions of all kinds, reinvigorating student council, so out of classroom, but student-led activities. And the third is maybe a topic for another question, but it is about the difficulty of teaching American history and how controversial that is, depending on what perspective should be brought in. And there's a lot of inquiry learning in that domain of teaching American history. And I'm happy to say more about that if that's of interest.
I'm particularly interested in, as I read that report and some of the work of the Hastings Institute, and you started your comments in talking about the pandemic and navigating this pandemic and kind of the public information campaign that goes around that. And I fundamentally I've taken away from the last couple of years, but also from reviewing your writing, that the public in a broad sense doesn't necessarily understand the scientific process. Am I right in saying that?
Yes.
That's so many of the challenges that you're highlighting there. Because there does seem to be conflicting information, right? But in some ways we're learning as we go, and we're living this in real time.
Absolutely. I mean, teaching STEM is important, and science literacy is essential. It seems almost as though people had a gotcha kind of attitude in some quarters when Dr. Fauci would change his statement about the power of masking, for example, not realizing that science is a process. It's a process of discovery and correction and self-correction. It's an iterative process that has certain ground rules for producing evidence and for giving us confidence in the findings, but it's contingent and always changing. We have a kind of, along with a loss of civic learning, we have a kind of absolutism that's coming into our culture that is uncomfortable with ambiguity and complexity and evolution of thought. And as we reinvigorate civics learning, I hope we will help students develop more tolerance for ambiguity and complexity and less absolutism.
Thank you very much for that response. So I'm going to go to the audience. The first question that we received focuses specifically on the cultural differences that divide us in this country, and whether teaching young people to bridge those differences, and we could probably even move beyond culture. There's so many cleavages, right, in our democracy that define our views about basic issues like the pandemic, right, about climate change, some of the issues that Dr. Solomon raised. But should civic education weigh into that? Should it help young people to bridge those divides? I open that up to both of you.
Well, I have two responses to that. The divides are very much there. And earlier, a few days ago, the Hastings Center held a conference on health equity. And one of the major presentations focused on residential segregation in the United States, which has so many sequelae. The fact that we don't, we have rural white America, we have concentrated poverty in some cities with and then we have white suburbs, and we learned a history of why it is that we have a geography like that, but also what its consequences are. And that means that kids don't mix it up in their neighborhoods, but they also don't interact in schools. And now with the increasing wealth gap, there's also divides within those racialized and ethnic communities based on increasing unconscionable wealth gaps that are undermining our democracy as well, because it's very hard to have a robust democracy when there are such extremes of material inequality. So I think I lost my train of thought about what the question was.
Is a bridging cultural divides,
yeah.
And the role of civic education.
Yeah. So we're in very different locations, and we're not going to school together, which is a real difficulty. I think another way, though, to try to bridge that is to do something that iCivics has been advocating and the roadmap has been advocating, which is to teach hard history, to tell the stories of Jim Crow. To tell the stories of our westward movement and its impact on Indigenous people. And back to my ambiguity theme, to find a way that we can tell stories for people who may feel disempowered, who may not see their voices reflected, but in a way that doesn't lead to cynicism or despair. And on the other hand, that's balanced with celebration of what an amazing experiment in democracy the United States is, and that is genuinely celebrates that without moving into adulation or false nostalgia. So how do we chart that path that is so difficult, but is really worth the struggle? And I think that would be one way to try to give voice to people who feel that their voices are not being heard.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon.
Yeah. I think that's so right on, Millie. That, I think it's so important that we remind folks that the promise of democracy is not that it is somehow perfect, but that it is but its capacity for change, right? That's why we fight for democracy, because with all of its flaws, and you can hold in your head at the same time a reverence for and you can value democracy, even as you are so cognizant of all of the ways in which it has been imperfectly implemented. If you focus on the fact that we are the government, it is indeed a government of and by the people, and that we can be the agents of change if we know how. So civics, to me, needs to really focus heavily on how can you as an individual be a more effective agent of change. Mm-hmm. Imagine the future you want, and then be part of making that happen. And that's the promise of moving towards a more perfect union. So that is that activism part. And I think, Sean, one of the ways that you begin to bridge divides, whether it's among adults or students, is coming together around a common purpose, and I know, Millie, you've been involved in some of that, Danielle Allen and so many others who speak so eloquently about common purpose. Something as simple as picking up trash along the side of the highway, painting an elderly person's home for them, whatever it might be. If you spend the day in activity with someone who is different than you, and at the end of the day, you find out they voted for the other person, it's so much harder to demonize them. Right? We can work. Civics should work to bring to remind people of some shared fundamental values of our democracy in a kind of abstract way, and I think it is important to do that. But realizing that we have a shared value in picking up trash along the side of the highway can be just as powerful. Little things like finding out that they root for the same football team that you do, can help bridge those divides.
Thank you. That's a wonderful response, both of you. So a little bit more of an international flavor to this question. I'm going to dedicate this one to Suzanne. One kind of two parts. So maybe I'll just ask you to elaborate on some of your opening remarks where you talked about Russian interference, and particularly in the context of the 2016 election. But what is the role of some of our foreign adversaries in dividing us as a people in America?
Yeah. So, Russia has long been engaged in exacerbating divisive issues, and again, picking up on legitimate grievances. So from the dawn of time, practically, they have pushed this narrative that, yes, America is a racist, fundamentally and irrevocably a racist state. And you see that in their information operations and their narratives over and over and over again. And it certainly comes up in the context, obviously, of our justice system and the fight for racial justice. That they take the immigration issue and drive a wedge, exacerbate on both sides of that issue. So much of what we saw is when the immigration bumps up against the justice system, Russia is there pushing the narrative that our justice system is soft on immigrants and refugees and puts them ahead of American citizens. And they promote there's an awful story in Twin Falls, Idaho in the summer of 2016, where they pushed a false narrative to undermine trust in the justice system. We all know the story of Garland, Texas, where they tried to turn people out on both sides of the immigration issue and sent people with weapons to try to have a violent altercation. They want to exacerbate the protest potential of the population, to use a term from their military technology, or for their military doctrine. So that's Russia's, definitely sees that as an important way to weaken us. China sees it as a way to compete on the world stage in places in which we are competing for influence. And what they point to more is the messiness of democracy. And I heard someone the other day very, very nicely put it: disagreement is a feature of democracy, not a bug, which is why civil discourse is so important. We value some of that. What looks like messiness is part of what makes democracy vibrant, right? But China really is out there portraying it as broken, as an inefficient way. And Putin pulls us down. China thinks they have a different model to sell.
And you're alluding to this. I don't know if these messages that Russia and China are driving are what they actually believe, right? But there has been a bunch of recent research. I think Freedom House in particular stands out, where we get a sense of, frankly, the state of our democracy and how others view the United States as a democracy. What's your sense of how others, both our friends and our enemies, perceive us in the state of our democracy, Suzanne?
I think they're worried for us, and that worries them, for themselves. I think they want, my sense from my conversations with folks around the world, back in the days when I used to be able to travel, is that they really want us. They want us to be that city on the hill, right? That shining city on the hill. They want to be able to point to this, but they are very worried about the indications of vulnerability. And I think we need to take that more seriously ourselves, that democracy is not invincible. It is not inevitable. If we don't fight for it, if we don't understand, learn, take the time and effort to learn how to strengthen our democracy, we do really run the risk of losing it. And I think just as sometimes somebody standing on the outside can see more clearly what's going on in that room than the people in it, I think oftentimes people around the world may have a more clear-eyed view about the risks to our democracy than we do.
And I was stunned, as I said at the top, the polling data from NBC just yesterday, where 76% of us, and it was actually over 70% for Democrats, Republicans, and independents, see our democracy as threatened. So even on the inside, we see that. Dr. Solomon, and I should say, wonderful questions so far. Keep them coming in the YouTube chat as we go. Dr. Solomon, science and civics share a common characteristic in that each discipline has foundational core concepts. So the three branches of government, as I talked about at the top, how a bill becomes a law in civics, and then of course the scientific method, which you've spoken about earlier, the elemental properties, but much more complexity as we go deeper into these subjects in school. How do we build a foundation for that deeper understanding at different ages and in this political climate that we're talking about, where complexity is increasingly unwelcome?
Well, first, I think we can start very young and talk about the virtues that are required for citizens in a democracy. It's the opposite of vitriol and outrage that we are hearing from each other constantly now. And there are programs in schools that I know of that have decided that they're going to make virtues and character development a central feature of what kids will take out of their learning experiences from age 5 and younger even. Sort of being explicit about how do we talk with one another, asking somebody who you disagree with to explain their position one more time, asking the person who thinks they disagree to tell what the other person's position is. So they practice listening and respecting each other. So I think we can and should do this at a very early age. And then as kids get older, coming up with these questions that are real world questions. The great pragmatist philosopher John Dewey was very practical in his orientation towards learning, and he felt it was about problem solving in how we live together. Suzanne's talked about change being the great, having a vision of change and ever moving towards ever greater standards of justice. And that's what civics is about, and that's what democracy is about. It's forward looking. Well, making our education forward looking and bringing kids into that sense that I am developing skills so I can make the world a better place. Kids are very idealistic, and we can capture that and build from there. Can I ask a question from that Suzanne's comments sparked in me?
Absolutely.
Given your background in cybersecurity and your familiarity with the way that Russian disinformation is undermining is building polarities, and in particular, my understanding is that a lot of the anti-vaccine messages on the internet seem to come from different sources. Some are from Russia itself, where there are some terrible messages that are being distributed about the vaccines that are just not true, but very much originating from Russia, suggesting that the vaccines are not effective. And then we have good old American style snake oil entrepreneurs is what I like to call them, who are advocating, remedies that are not, that don't work, but that are lucrative for them because they're marketing, bottles full of oregano or hydrogen peroxide. So these are clearly threats. They are national security threats because if we're all dying, it's bioterrorism of a certain kind. What's your view on regulating disinformation on social media, taking away platforms? How do you see that going? I know that there are freedom of, there are speech concerns, but I'm feeling like we need to regulate this space and apply more like journalism ethics to it. That it's not just a neutral platform, but that journalism has had ethics for a long time that says you need to be able to show your sources and you need to be able to demonstrate that there's some truth to your story before you broadcast it. What's your take on how we deal with that kind of cybersecurity threat?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I platforms are not government entities, as you know. So of course, as you acknowledge, they are not subject to the First Amendment. They are important public platforms, and because they are so powerful, their decisions around what speech to allow and what speech not to allow have important public policy public implications, right? That having been said, we have basically a contractual relationship with them, and they can set their terms of use, and they do. And they ought to be doing everything they can, both with regard to the technological tools they deploy and the policies they create, to not allow health hazardous information, right, to be pushed on their platforms. Just as they have come around to, no platform today, no responsible platform today would hesitate to take down something that said election day has been moved to November 10th. Right? If they got wind of that, they would take that down in a minute. Similarly, they ought to have these kinds of mechanisms when it comes to these very real and clear objective implications for the public's health. So I don't have any problem with that. I do think one of the things that's going to help us in this regard, both from the concerns about the public policy implications of controlling speech and potentially creating incentives for less toxic environments, is greater competition among social media platforms. And it may seem a little counterintuitive, but I really do think that if we gave people an opportunity to vote with their feet, to realistically pick up and move to a platform that had a less toxic, less dangerous, less, kind of environment, that would help. And similarly, if speech that is deemed by a big platform to be harmful to the public, already they have other places to go. To some degree, if we don't have policy from Congress on what should and shouldn't be allowed on those platforms, it reduces the concern about censorship, right? If you've got more competition.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, John, for letting
me know. That was a wonderful question, and appreciate the response. And got another question from the audience, and I'm going to start it off, but I want to turn it to both of you and your kind of domain specific expertise. The question we got is what elements of civic education could be most impactful in bridging our divides. And when I asked Dr. Solomon an earlier question about the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, there is a pedagogical companion that goes into kind of research-based best practices that answer this question. So not going to elaborate on all of those practices, but one of the most impactful, probably implicit in our conversation today, is structured engagement of current and controversial issues in the classroom. And the classroom is such a great place for this because there's actually a surprising amount of heterogeneity in our classrooms of every type, right? Including ideological heterogeneity. most of us in our adult lives are not in environments where there's a great deal of heterogeneity, and there are huge benefits to that, right? The other piece is, of course, young people are still figuring out what their views are on the issues of the day. And maybe most importantly, they're in the company of a trained professional, a social studies teacher, who's particularly astute at facilitating these conversations. So I would say that's the most impactful way of doing this. And as a society, we lack those muscles, right? In fact, we've been told not to talk about political issues in polite company. So it's not surprising that we don't know how to do that. And the research suggests that the extent to which we do this, it's with people who agree with us, which leads to actually ideological amplification. So our views actually even become more extreme. So we really do need to learn how to have those conversations with people who we might not agree with. And I think the classroom is just a great place to begin that. I invite our other panelists to weigh in on that. But I think the other piece that has been very implicit in both of your remarks, and I'm interested in your kind of domain specific responses to this too. So the science perspective, for example, Dr. Solomon, but media literacy, right? So in order to talk about current issues, we need to be media literate, because that's where we're finding this information for better and for worse. So I turn to you kind of just broadly about how we can bridge these divides through civic education, but would love your views on how we can navigate this digital information landscape that you were just talking about, Suzanne, in your last remark.
I can take a start at that. I mean, I think it's really critical that we not only teach the scientific method and comfort with the fact that findings evolve as we study, but that we also teach students how to evaluate the sources of information, how to, it's sometimes very hard because there's been some sophisticated messaging that's tried to conceal its sources and copy more respectful sources. So it can be very difficult, but there are increasing efforts to teach kids how to ask a series of critical questions about the source of the information, what they should look for to see if they think it has integrity or not. And we need more curricula and more pedagogy on that. There is also some organized and effective curricula on recognizing propaganda, which is a little bit different, but I think we could learn something from those existing programs.
Can I push you a little further on that? Because I am not as familiar with sciences, but a friend and colleague of mine, Sam Weinberg, Dr. Sam Weinberg at Stanford. He leads something called the Stanford History Education Group. Obviously, his background's in history too. He's a historian, but he's written about how media literacy is kind of applicable across the disciplines, and his organization's actually doing some work in other academic subject areas. But how do we specifically focus on developing that media literacy in the sciences?
There is an essay, and I have to do a little advertisement here. So I was trying to put this in the chat, Sean, but a link to it because it's free and downloadable. There's an essay here by Miriam Solomon, who's a philosopher of science, who lays out what she thinks such a curriculum should address. So I think it would be great to kind of take her philosophical view of how we do it and create a project. Maybe your friend is already doing this with teachers and curriculum developers to roll out what that would look like. So we've done the work of publishing her concept for it, but to my knowledge, it hasn't really been developed, except with some very engaging teachers who are trying things out in their own classroom, but not at a national level yet.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I think that's where SHEG is. They're integrating this in a school district across ninth grade subjects.
Oh, wonderful.
Science being one of those, but yeah, and their research to date, just on, I mean, one of the more powerful findings that resonated with me was that PhD historians don't know how to navigate the information landscape. Stanford undergraduates don't know how to do this. It's the most selective university in the country. So as a people, we don't know how to do this. So it speaks to how important it is. Suzanne, any thoughts on media literacy, particularly as it relates to your area of expertise in mis and disinformation?
Well, I'm really encouraged by the discussion about the ongoing research and the ways that people are approaching this. I think it's so critically important that we teach our teachers and how to have these controversial conversations, and then that we back them up when they do have them. I just think it's so sad when teachers suffer the consequences because one parent wrote an angry letter. But I also think, schools, the K through 12 environment is one in which it should be about that inquiry, right? And listening and learning, and not persuasion. And I think part of what happens with the social media and exacerbating the divisiveness is that young people see this as a competition of ideas, and their side has to win. And so what they're really looking for, this notion of confirmation bias, that what they're really looking for is arguments to support their preconceived notions. And this is why I think so many of the studies that look at efforts at media literacy say it just further confirms. The more they look, you tell them to go look for other sources and things, they wind up believing more deeply, because the whole time they're really looking for backup for their side. And so fundamentally, we got to get back to this idea that this is just an open-ended inquiry. This is about learning. This is about understanding the other side. And so, I think Dr. Solomon talked about maybe this idea that you'd have to take the other side and argue it, right? Not to persuade, right? This is not about, and so when we have these debates, then you vote, then everybody votes and which side won. No, this is not about persuading other people of your point of view having these conversations. You are having these conversations to increase mutual understanding.
I think what you just said is incredibly important. It's not about persuasion. It's about understanding and having reasons for one's views, but not so they can be thrown down the throat of the other person, but so that they can clarify your understanding of it. So that was beautifully put. Thank you.
Dr. Solomon, if we got a prompt from the audience or a question from the audience just about where they can find the essay that you're referring to. So I know is it on the Hastings Center site?
It is, but it might not be that easy to find. So I better make sure it gets put into an easy place. But is there any way that I can put it into chat right now?
I will get back to you on that.
Here, I've got it open. May I just? It's actually come up.
Yep. Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully that's a live link. And if it isn't, then you can go to the website and just search Democracy in Crisis.
Okay.
And the essay that I was talking about is by Miriam Solomon. She's the philosopher of science, who's talking about a new framework for teaching science that focuses on critical literacy. And then in the same report is an essay by Mira Levinson and Mildred Solomon on why we need to do what Suzanne is advocating and what Sean iCivics advocates, why we need to do civics learning.
I really appreciate both essays, but the one by Miriam Sullivan, where she talked a lot about the way we talk about climate change and kind of put forth a different paradigm where we basically say, hey, there's absolute consensus, climate change is a real thing, but there are a couple of people that disagree, right? And both sides kind of use that as leverage to drive their point, and she kind of turns that upside down. So I really appreciate that frame. And yeah, the whole report is fantastic. So we got a comment that I'd love either of you to weigh in on, and happy to do so myself too. But kind of picking up from where I talked about at the top of my opening remarks, how STEM became such a success, how the federal government is investing intensely in it, right? $54 a K-12 student. And this comment in particular said, we need to mirror those successes, but why did STEM become such a national priority?
I have a view on that
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, STEM became a national priority because for two reasons. One is our cultural identity in the United States is very tied up with technological expertise. It's a part of who we are. It's part of our cultural narrative, but also, and I think more importantly, it's a commercial driver. So we put all those billions of dollars into STEM because we were trying to drive we told kids it was about careers, and it is about careers, but it's such a huge financial and commercial driver of our society. And I think while it represents a model for how, if only we would do for civic learning what we did for STEM, I understand that point, but we should also bear in mind that that's part of the reason we let civic learning, we neglected civic learning. I think there's like 3 reasons why we neglected civic learning, and that's one of the top ones. We changed our purpose for education. I mean, in 1780, Thomas Jefferson talked about public education, and U.S. schools were the very first to have public. The United States was the very first country to have public schools, and it was explicitly, although he only meant for white men, but nevertheless, it was explicitly a civic purpose, the belief that you can't have a democracy unless you have an educated citizenry who knows how to reason together around collective problems. That was the main impulse for public education. But somewhere along the way, it shifted to preparation for career. And STEM in the United States is one of the biggest, most promising areas for career development. The second reason we neglected civic learning was then we just measured, as you said in your opening, No Child Left Behind, we just measured other things. We didn't measure this. And once you don't measure it, it becomes invisible. And then later it just weakens. And then I think the third is it's just too controversial and teachers are afraid of it. And so I think one of the smart things about the roadmap is it really takes very seriously the importance of professional development of teachers. I don't think teachers can do this without support and preparation. And I think that's a really brilliant goal that the Roadmap for Educating for American Democracy has. And I really hope there's resources put into professional development of teachers. We would love to do more professional development, enabling teachers to teach bioethics inquiry, because that frightens them too. I mean, it's not really very different. The questions in bioethics, should we do human gene editing in permanent heritable ways? Should we change mosquitoes for public health purposes if we don't know the ecological consequences? All these questions are very controversial. And teachers are worried. They often say that they know their kids would love it, but they don't feel they can control the class, and they can't control the parents' reactions if the kids go home and say, this is what we talked about in school. So there are ways to manage that, but teachers need help in developing those strategies.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And once again, Dr. Saltman's referring to the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. It does have a number of policy recommendations, including pedagogical practices. And a big piece, you're right, it's absolutely central to improving civic education in this country is investing in teachers. Teachers at the collegiate level, pre-service teachers, but then in-service teachers need ongoing access to high quality professional development opportunities where they develop both their content expertise, but also their pedagogical expertise. So that's embedded in the roadmap. And it's also a big part of a federal bill that we're working on called the Civic Secures Democracy Act, which would bring significant funding frankly, to every level, but mostly to states and districts. And a big piece of that would support teacher training, also a major investment in higher education, and an effort as part of that to diversify our teaching force, which social studies teachers are even less diverse than the teaching force as a whole. So would set up a new program to address that. Suzanne, any thoughts on STEM and why it has had such success and what we can do to
first of all,
there?
On the Civic Secures Democracy Act, you may have said this, but I think it's important to note that it is one of those rare bipartisan pieces of legislation in both the House and the Senate, has Republican and Democratic co-sponsors. On the, I was fascinated, Millie, with your assessment of why we've invested so much more in STEM, and I think you're exactly right. I was going to say Sputnik, right? Sort of was
That
the
too, yeah.
impetus that made us feel, but it's all consistent. What you've explained is why that has been then sustained over the many decades, and what were the implications of that, where we suddenly felt a national security threat from Russia being ahead of us on this technology front, but part of our cultural identity, as you said, and all the rest of that. What really was interesting to me, though, about what you were talking about is that the shift to the business focus, right? And that STEM businesses see a reason for investing in STEM because they need that pipeline of STEM educated workforce. And part of what we're trying to do with this, both civics as also being a national security imperative, just as urgent as the technology was in the wake of Sputnik, but also that there is a business case to be made for civics, for investing in civics education. And Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, speaks very eloquently about why he thinks it's important for his workforce to have a good grounding in civics education and understand their role in the world, right? And their responsibilities as well as their rights. You talk about rights and obligations. We talk about dealing with the divisiveness. Employers have the same divisiveness potentially in their workforce, right? I mean, their workforces are microcosms of our society. So in the workplace, talking about civil discourse, right? How to disagree without being disagreeable. What are some of the things we have in common? How do we find a shared value to bring a greater unity and cohesiveness to your workforce? That's a business imperative. Certainly, respect for the rule of law. Democracy is essential for business, and a respect for the rule of law is essential for commerce, right? It's essential for innovation, both in terms of the protection of innovative ideas. So again, respect for the rule of law and a strong justice system, but also that marketplace of ideas that we talked about, right, Sean, and both of you talked about it. How do we get people to brainstorm together, to take risks, to put ideas out there? You have to have an environment in which you are not going to be shot down right away, right? And that's part of that civic discourse, civic responsibility, shared sense of community. There are increasingly businesses understand that civics education can benefit them just as STEM does.
Thank you, Suzanne. And the Harvard Business School actually published the business case for civic education, and U.S. Chamber of Commerce has partnered on that and has really taken a lead. So that is super important. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So want to just ask both Suzanne and Dr. Solomon a quick to kind of weigh in quickly. Where do we go next with this? You have such an impressive body of work from your different domains. Suzanne, I know you talked a little bit about civics at work, but yeah, really interested. What are the next steps with your work with respect to this issue?
Yeah, well, we are, as I say, we're launching this Civics at Work. And, if there are folks out there who have ideas about companies they think would be interested in being part of this effort and signing on to a statement of support for civics education and undertaking a commitment to do some very practical, real things, feel free to reach out to me at csis.org. And we're also going to bring this Civics at Work, I think, to the federal workforce and state, to the public sector, to government workforces. So that's a big part of what we're doing. And then we're looking at, and particularly the national security community, how important it is to make sure that that our national security workforce has a good grounding in the foundations of our democracy.
Thank you. Dr. Solomon?
Yes, we are doing a variety of things. I'll give you 3 examples. This summer, we are launching our inaugural program in bioethics, almost synonymous with civics education, because it's an inquiry-oriented approach to helping young people, undergraduates, mostly from underrepresented communities, young people of color, We are advertising it with the historical Black universities and colleges, but also in some more rural areas of the United States. We're going to bring 20 young people together to give them practice in making civic decisions about controversial issues in the life sciences. That's something that is modeled on something we did for teachers several years ago. So a second thing we'd like to do is to be able to find a way to do quite a bit more around professional development of teachers using examples from the life sciences, but really it's a practice in civic learning, just happens to be targeted on cases that come from bioethics. I was curious to hear about the new legislation that's making its way that might be able to provide support for teacher training, because that's been one of the challenges that we face. And then third, we are interested in mounting more public deliberations for the general public, using some documented, evidence-based deliberative processes that have been developed at Stanford. And we're looking for different routes into funding that as well. So the general public, teachers, and students.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, the time we have for today's program has ended. I want to thank Suzanne Spalding and Dr. Solomon for their participation. It's a fascinating, rich conversation. This program and others like it will soon be found on the Commonwealth Club's website at www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Sean Healy of iCivics, and this Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned.